The room fell silent long before anyone realized why. It wasn't the chalk scratching against the board, nor the weight of the impossible equation that stretched from one end of the whiteboard to the other, like a challenge carved in stone. It was something else, something shifting, something unseen, like the quiet moment before a storm breaks. Professor Whitfield had spent decades building his reputation on breaking minds before building them back stronger. Harvard's most feared and revered mathematician, known for turning brilliance into humility with a single question, stood before the class with calm certainty. He had just written what he called unsolvable under pressure, a problem designed not to be solved but to expose the limits of even the brightest students. And then from the middle row, a hand slowly rose, not confident, not hesitant, just steady. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of rising when the world expects you to stay down, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Her name was Amara. Most people in that lecture hall didn't know it yet. They knew her as the quiet girl who always sat in the same seat, second row from the aisle, notebooks filled with dense writing but rarely a voice to match. She wasn't the loudest, nor the most noticeable. In a place like Harvard, where brilliance competed with brilliance, she blended into the background like a shadow no one bothered to trace. But shadows, as it turns out, often hide the brightest light. Amara hadn't grown up with whiteboards or polished lecture halls. She had grown up in a small, worn apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing and the nights were often louder than sleep. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her hands always tired, her smile always forced but determined. There were no tutors, no prep schools, no safety nets, only borrowed books late nights, and a mind that refused to quit. She learned math the way some people learn survival, by necessity, by instinct, by hunger. Every number was a puzzle piece, every problem a door she refused to leave unopened. While other kids memorized formulas, Amara questioned them. While others followed steps, she rewrote them, not because she was trying to be different, but because it was the only way she knew how to understand the world. And yet, even with all that fire inside her, Harvard had a way of dimming it. Not intentionally, not cruelly, just quietly. In classrooms filled with confidence, legacy, and privilege, Amara often felt like an outsider looking in. Her voice stayed locked behind doubt. Her thoughts, though brilliant, remained unspoken. It wasn't that she didn't know the answers. It was that she wasn't sure she was allowed to have them until that day. Professor Whitfield stepped back from the board, scanning the room with the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that said he already knew the outcome. Students shifted in their seats. Some stared at the equation like it might blink first. Others looked down, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to be called on. And then his eyes landed on her, that raised hand. A ripple passed through the room. Heads turned. Whispers began to stir. Not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to question. Her? The girl who never spoke? Whitfield paused for just a moment longer than usual. Not out of doubt, but curiosity. There was something in the way she held her hand. Not eager, not desperate, just certain. That made him nod. He gestured toward the front. Amara stood. And in that moment, everything she had ever been told, not with words, but with silence, pressed against her. Every time she hesitated, every time she second-guessed herself, every time she felt invisible, it all stood with her. But so did something stronger. Every late night, every sacrifice her mother made, every page she studied under flickering light, every moment she chose not to give up, step by step, she walked toward the board. The room watched. Some curious, some doubtful, some already convinced they knew how this would end. Amara picked up the chalk. Her hand didn't tremble. Her mind didn't rush. She simply looked at the equation, not as an impossible wall, but as something familiar, something solvable, because to her it wasn't just math. It was language, and she understood it. She began to write. At first, it was slow, careful, precise. Each step deliberate, like placing stones across a river. The room leaned in, not physically, but mentally. Followed every movement. The professor watched more closely now, arms folded, interest sharpening. Minutes passed. The silence deepened. Something was happening. Something was happening. Not just an attempt, but progress. Amira wasn't guessing. She wasn't trying random paths. She was navigating it like she had been there before, like the problem wasn't new. It had just been waiting for her to arrive. A shift in the room became undeniable. Students who had looked away were now fully locked in. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed. Others exchanged glances, confusion turning into something else. Respect, because what they were witnessing wasn't luck, it was mastery. Halfway through, she paused, not out of uncertainty, but to rethink a step. She erased a small section and rewrote it, cleaner, sharper. That moment alone spoke louder than confidence. It spoke of understanding. Professor Whitfield's expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. The man who built his reputation on being unshakable had just leaned forward. Amara continued. The equation, once sprawling and intimidating, began to take shape. Patterns emerged, connections aligned. What had seemed impossible slowly unraveled into something elegant. And then she stopped. One final line, one final step. The chalk made a soft sound as it completed the solution. Amara stepped back. Silence. But this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was disbelief, the kind that sits heavy before it transforms into something else. Professor Whitfield approached the board slowly, eyes scanning every line, every step. The room held its breath as if even the air was afraid to move. Seconds stretched. Then he nodded, once firm, certain, and in that moment everything changed. Not just for Amara, but for everyone watching. Because it wasn't just that she solved it, it was how she did it. With calm, with clarity, with a brilliance that didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed. The room erupted, not loudly at first, but in a wave that grew, building into applause that filled the hall. Not forced, not polite, earned. Amara stood there, not smiling, not celebrating, just breathing, because for her, this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally allowing herself to be right. Back in her seat, things felt different. The same room, the same people, but a different energy. Eyes that once overlooked her now saw her, not as the quiet girl, not as the background presence, but as someone undeniable. And perhaps more importantly, she saw herself. For the first time, the doubt didn't feel permanent. The silence didn't feel necessary. The voice she had kept hidden didn't feel out of place anymore. It felt ready. But what made that moment truly powerful wasn't the applause or the recognition. It was what came after. Days passed, and the story spread, not as gossip, but as something almost legendary. Students talked about it. Professors referenced it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. A reminder that brilliance doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting for the right moment to rise. Amara didn't change overnight. She didn't suddenly become the loudest voice in the room. She didn't chase attention, but she stopped shrinking. She started raising her hand more, speaking when it mattered, trusting herself, and slowly, that quiet confidence became something stronger than any performance. It became presence, the kind you can't ignore, the kind that doesn't need permission. Before we reach the end, take a moment and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what part of this story touched you the most. Your voice matters here, just like hers did. Because somewhere out there, someone is sitting in a room right now feeling invisible, feeling like they don't belong, feeling like their voice isn't strong enough. And maybe this story is what they need to hear, that it's not about where you start. It's not about how loud you are. It's not about who expects you to fail. It's about what you do when your moment comes. Do you stay silent or do you raise your hand? Mara did, and everything changed. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own struggles, your own quiet strength, take a moment to like, share, and engage with this video because your support helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. And maybe, just maybe, the next hand that rises will change everything too. The applause faded, but its echo refused to leave. For most students, it became a story they would tell over coffee, a moment to reference when conversations turned to the hardest class at Harvard. But for Amara, it was something far deeper, something that lingered in her chest long after the room had emptied. Because success, especially the kind that arrives suddenly, has a strange weight to it. It doesn't just lift you. It asks you who you are now that you've been seen. In the days that followed, Amara noticed the shift immediately. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No one made a grand announcement. But it was there, in the way classmates looked at her, in the way conversations paused when she spoke, and the subtle invitations to study groups she had never been part of before. Recognition had found her, but with it came something else. Expectation. For the first time, people weren't overlooking her, they were watching. And that was terrifying because it's one thing to succeed once. It's another to feel like you have to prove it again and again and again. Amira felt it creeping in during lectures. The same classrooms that once made her feel invisible now felt heavy with pressure. When professors asked questions, her mind still moved quickly, still found answers. But now there was hesitation. What if that moment was just luck? What if she couldn't do it again? What if they were all waiting for her to fail? Doubt, the same quiet shadow that had followed her for years, hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed its voice. Back in her small dorm room, late at night, she sat surrounded by books and notes, but her focus drifted. The equation from that day replayed in her mind, not as a victory, but as a question. Was that really me? Her fingers traced the edge of a worn notebook, one she had carried with her long before Harvard. Inside it were pages filled with messy calculations, ideas scribbled in the margins, thoughts that didn't follow rules but somehow always found truth. That notebook didn't care about expectations. It only cared about understanding. And slowly, something inside her began to settle. Because Amara realized something important. She hadn't solved that problem because she was trying to impress anyone. She had solved it because she loved the process, because to her, math wasn't a performance, it was a conversation. She had been fluent in it long before anyone was listening. That realization didn't erase the pressure overnight, but it gave her something stronger to hold on to: purpose. Weeks passed and another challenge came. This time, it wasn't just a single equation. Professor Whitfield announced a midterm project, one that had a reputation for breaking even the strongest students. It wasn't about solving a known problem. It was about creating a new approach, a new perspective, something original, the kind of assignment that couldn't be memorized, the kind that demanded truth. As the room buzzed with quiet anxiety, Amara felt that familiar pull of uncertainty again. This wasn't about raising her hand for a moment. This was about sustaining something, proving something. And the old fear whispered louder. But this time, she didn't listen. Instead, she did something simple. She went back to her notebook. Night after night, she worked, not for approval, not for validation, but for clarity. She explored ideas that didn't always work. She followed paths that led nowhere. She erased more than she wrote. And slowly, something began to form. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Meanwhile, around her, the pressure consumed others. Students who once seemed unshakable grew frustrated. Some stuck rigidly to traditional methods, afraid to fail. Others overcomplicated their work, trying to prove brilliance instead of finding it. Amara watched quietly and learned because she realized something most people didn't. The fear of being wrong was louder than the desire to be right. And that fear was the real barrier. The night before the project was due, Amara sat alone again. The campus outside was silent, wrapped in the stillness of late hours. Her work lay in front of her, pages filled with ideas, connections, and a solution that didn't follow the expected path. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The next day, as students submitted their work, the atmosphere was tense. There were no easy answers, no immediate feedback, just quiet anticipation. When it was Amara's turn, she walked forward with the same steady presence she had carried before. Not because she wasn't nervous, but because she understood something now. Fear doesn't disappear. You just stop letting it decide. Professor Whitfield took her work without expression, placing it among the others. There was no reaction, no hint of what he thought. And so once again, she waited. Days passed, then a week, and finally the results came. The lecture hall filled with a kind of silence that only comes when something important is about to happen. Papers were handed back one by one, each student reacting in their own way: relief, disappointment, confusion. Amara sat still, her hands resting lightly on the desk. Then her name was called. She stood, walked forward, and took the paper. For a moment, she didn't look, because sometimes the seconds before knowing feel heavier than the truth itself. But then slowly, she turned it over. At the top, in clear, deliberate writing, was a single word: exceptional. And beneath it, something else, a note, not long, not elaborate, just a few words. You didn't just solve the problem, you changed it. Amara's breath caught not in shock, but in something deeper: recognition, not of performance, but of perspective. So, perspective. As she returned to her seat, the room felt different again. Not because people were watching, but because she wasn't looking for their approval anymore. She had found something stronger, her voice. Not loud, not forced, but undeniable. Before we come to the final moment of this journey, take a second to comment below with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word, because sometimes that's all it takes to be heard. Because this story was never just about a classroom. It was about every moment someone feels unseen, every time someone questions their worth, every silent battle fought behind steady eyes. Amara's story didn't end with applause. It didn't end with a perfect grade. It continued in every step she took after choosing to believe in herself. In every room she entered without shrinking. In every idea she shared without apology. And in every person who saw her and realized, maybe I can do that too. Years later, people would still talk about that day in Professor Whitfield's class, not because of the difficulty of the problem, but because of what it revealed. That brilliance doesn't ask for permission, that confidence isn't always loud, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who changes everything. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, take a moment to like, share, and engage with this video. You never know who might need this reminder today, because somewhere right now, someone is sitting in silence, holding back, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, they're one raised hand away from everything changing.